Title of my presentation is Social and Education Sciences Research Informed Consent of Vulnerable Participants. So this presentation is about obtaining informed consent, which is part of ethics, which has legal and ethical implications, and the premise is on the vulnerable populations, which is defined as children's, prisoners, individuals that are educationally disadvantaged, intellectually disadvantaged. And then it talks about institutional review boards and obtaining informed consent from vulnerable populations. So from a historical perspective, there's been a lot of studies from the early 1900s that used individuals from vulnerable populations without their consent. And then also there's been studies that have excluded individuals from vulnerable populations from being included in studies that involved their lived experiences, and they weren't represented in research where they should have been. So both being included when they should not have been included, and then being excluded when they should have been included. So there's been a lot of advances in research since that point, and advances in the laws since that point as well, and protections of human rights internationally and in the United States. So this presentation focuses on ways to protect the rights of individuals that are from vulnerable populations, both legally and through accommodations in the informed consent process. So as mentioned, the common rule refers to children, prisoners, individuals with impaired decision-making capacity, economically disadvantaged, educationally disadvantaged individuals who are subject to be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence when trying to obtain informed consent and participate in research studies. Which puts them at risk, which when institutional review boards are approving research studies, they look to see what types of participants are participating in the studies to see if there's any vulnerable populations. But institutional review boards don't look at just who's participating in the study and look at them as broad categories and groups. They look at the individuals actually participating in the studies to determine what those specific individuals' needs are, to determine if they can participate in the study based on the risks that those participants pose. Looking at individuals with specific types of disabilities. Specific types of disabilities can be key factors for risk factors for becoming a vulnerable population. For example, individuals with intellectual disabilities, they can have more key factors for being a vulnerable population. But it's important to include individuals with intellectual disabilities in research studies because they're the experts on their own lives. So we don't want to do research on intellectual disabilities without including them because we're talking about their shared experiences. And so we want their input and their influence in the study, but we want to make sure that they understand what the study is about and they understand that they're giving informed consent. So there's research that's currently being done using digital tools and assistive technology to help with the explanatory process of informed consent and talking about the research studies, specifically with individuals with Fragile X syndrome, and it's showing promise in that direction. So more research needs to be done with using that digital tool with things other than the Fragile X syndrome. Also, modified communication systems and other types of assistive technology can be used for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Likewise, students with learning disabilities have trouble with verbal and memory aptitudes. that can impact their ability to give informed consent. So helping them with choices, decision-making during the informed consent process can be helpful with individuals with learning disabilities. Ethics with autism research shows that they have troubles with self-determination skills and empowerment. And so helping students with autism and children with autism and adults with autism going through the informed consent process, making the decisions, helping them with multiple modes of participation, adapted survey instruments, accessible interview measures, and data handled by proxy reporters. Having somebody who helps to represent them with them during the informed consent process can help individuals with autism. Obtaining informed consent. The public responsibility in medicine and research, the primer, helps to give training and support for IRBs to help prepare them to be able to ethically and responsibly engage for making sure that human rights are protected, including in the informed consent process. There's numerous innovative means of obtaining informed consent from vulnerable populations to make sure that the rights and interests are protected. And in a lot of cases, they have children with disabilities as co-researchers for participants in narrative research. And when focusing on vulnerable populations, it's important to build and maintain trusting relationships, reasonable accommodations to support decision-making, and plan for the development of empathic relationships. And then after obtaining informed consent, it's important to then maintain the informed consent through reflective questioning and maintaining that the understanding of the vulnerable population throughout the research study continues to maintain that informed consent and level of understanding throughout the research study. Universal design for learning can be helpful for obtaining the informed consent and maintaining the informed consent throughout the study. So universal design for learning, the UDL framework, was originally designed for education settings to meet the needs of a variety of learners, both without and with disabilities. It provides principles that apply to the IRB process as well. There's 3 principles for the application within the UDL model: representation, engagement, and expression. So representation is how the information is presented to the individual. So for purposes of informed consent, representation is how the information is represented to the individual. So when presenting the informed consent to the individual with disabilities, things that can be helpful for accommodations, the use of editing tools, changing the font type, changing the size of the font, the color of the font, the background contrast, making it highly visible, using appropriate graphics. Another representation is to support the understanding of written and visual content through descriptions, alternate formats, pictures, graphics, digital files for screen readers. So changing the representation of how the informed consent is representing to the individual with disabilities. Engagement and expression, how the individual interacts with the content and reflects their knowledge and the understanding of the content back to the provider. Ideas to consider for these categories include the flexibility in communication, verbal and written communication for clarity, utilization of live readers, incorporation of e-readers via text, open and closed captioning, and alternate locations for ease. So the idea of using accommodations and assistive technology for obtaining informed consent and maintaining informed consent throughout the process. Universal design for learning and the institutional review board process. It's imperative to design IRB protocols which will engage and sustain participants' active engagement to ensure a successful research process. So using UDL with representation, engagement, and expression when developing the IRB and developing the research study to ensure that the individuals with disabilities are actively engaged throughout the entire process, from getting the informed consent through maintaining and sustaining that informed consent process throughout the research study. So in conclusion, it's imperative to protect the rights of all research study participants, including those from vulnerable populations, the right to be included in research that involves their lived experience, and the right to understand fully the informed consent for the study. With certain individuals from vulnerable populations, it may be necessary to use accommodations and modifications of UDL to make the informed consent process accessible and comprehensible for the participants, both while obtaining the informed consent and maintaining the informed consent. And to uphold legal and ethical procedures, institutional review boards must remain aware of the assistive technology and other accommodations that can assist with the fidelity of the informed consent process when administered to vulnerable populations.